right. Thank you. It is so fun to look out and recognize everyone here. I've heard some of you say, well, I know what all those words mean, tragedy and commons, but I don't know what they all mean together. So thank you for being curious and coming this afternoon. So there's a sociologist, C. Wright Mills, that's known for a few things, and one of them is the sociological imagination. And what is this imagination? It's trying to see your biography of who you are in the historical moment in which you're living to try to make sense of the social world around you. What social structures have influenced who you are, and how then can you influence the society around you? So that's really what I think of these talks. It's like using our imagination of who are we as humans, as people, as researchers. What historical moments did we grow up in? What influenced us? And then this added piece of how did it lead to these sociological questions that we are interested in through our research. So thank you, Christine, for broadening our sociological imaginations. There's been 15 previous talks. I've loved getting to learn more about my colleagues through them. They've been brave enough to put their baby pictures on the big screen, so gave me the courage to do it too. It's very valuable. It humanizes these titles we have. It allows us to see the whole person, and I'm just really appreciative to get to share some stuff that I barely ever share in academia. I also love being on the stage in the theater department. I've never been up here before. I probably never will be again. So I'm making a play. We are all here for 3 acts, multiple scenes in each act, and I'm wearing this headset, and I'm really feeling it. So thank you for letting me have my moment in the spotlight here. So the 3 acts that we're going to see tonight, Act 1 is seeing patterns in my lived experiences. So that's my first 15 years of memory of my life and things that the historical moment that I was in and the person that I was becoming and how they have, I think, looking back, shaped my path. At the time, you have no idea where your path is going, right? But looking back, I can see some patterns there. And then Act 2 is going to get into about 10 years of my research world of challenging unquestioned assumptions about humans and people and place and how they relate to the places where they live and work and play. So a lot of my research, as Christine mentioned, is challenging the accepted, that's just the way it is. That's just the way the world works, right? Sociologists loved to bust that open and say, well, but why? What's underneath that? What are the roots? So I'm going to talk about my kind of first chapter of research. And then Act 3 is going to get into what we call public sociology. How do you take the research that you're doing and put it into action in the community? Once you do this research, you're asking yourself, how then shall I live my life? So it's less about the publishing and more about participating. So that's where we're going. Where to begin? My good dear friend and colleague Carrie has really taught me to ask this question about when you start your research, where does the story begin? And most of the time, as academics, we start with where we went to grad school and who was our mentor and what was our dissertation title. That's like the start of your story as a researcher. And this talk is great because it asks you to start the story in a different place, right? Where you grew up, when you were a little kid, and who you are. So I'm going to start my story of growing up on a farm in New Jersey. There's another very important starting point. You could ask, well, how did you get there? How was your family there? Who was there before you? What is the context of this place that you found yourself in? And the original stewards and the Lenni Lenape and understanding where the story begins in a much longer horizon. So that's a very interesting starting point. But for today, for our time together, I'm starting with Act 1, Scene 1, Life in the Saddle. And I mean that, wow, there's a lot of saddle time in my childhood. On the spring horse, getting thrown in the saddle with my parents, my first pony spot. I was immersed in the horse world, like fully. Those are my memories. And I would say, too, that it wasn't like I got to, go regularly to a place that had horses. We lived it. We lived on a horse farm. It was my parents were caretakers, managers of a property. Somebody else owned it, but they were there 24/7 to, do the chores, take care of sick horses, maintain the property, everything that needs to be done on a horse farm, which means whoever is in that position has to live on the farm. So I got to grow up in an apartment above the barn, just immersed in horses, which sounds, very idyllic. But there was a lot of work. Even though my parents were the main, they had the position, the title, we were all pitching in, right? We were painting. I see my daughter laughing at me. We were painting the barn. We were, helping with the chores, the chickens, the spreading the manure. It was like all in, all hands on deck growing up on a horse farm. But there was a lot of help too. It wasn't just just my family. The farm had 30, 40 other families or individuals that boarded their horses there. And so every day there was always people around. They were, would pitch in here and there. We got to know them well. And it helped, spread the work around. And there was a lot of play time. We had fishing contests. We did, broom hockey. We had horse races. We'd have a haunted Halloween party for the whole community. But the thing that I really remember the most was the big pond on the farm. And we would go hang out with our inner tubes, and the horses would stand around. And then we'd hop on the horse and take the horse swimming. Then we'd build a rope swing. And it was just, it was hard work, but a lot of just really deep memories of being on a place that everybody was pitching in. At the time, growing up, I didn't know there was an outside owner, right? It just felt like this is a shared place on this farm where we all worked and we all played. And so I have a little aerial of what it looked like, that big pond, right? There's some barns. They're probably hard to see, but there's, a big horse barn and smaller horse barns, and these are the pastures and trails. And there's this big pond that, just great memories of childhood. And then around age 11 or 12, there was a big upheaval in this. And Bow Ridge Stables became Bow Ridge Estates. So we got word that there was a developer that was going to develop the farm. And even at 12 years old, I knew what the word develop meant, right? Like probably most of you. There's that word has a lot of possible meanings, but in the sense of land, it means develop, right? So develop meaning parcel it off and build houses. So the only thing that's kind of familiar is the pond is still there with fountains in it. And I feel like they really used the racetrack to their advantage, right? You can kind of see that outline there. But that was around age 12, this place that felt like it, built community, and we worked hard and we played hard, changed before my eyes. I mean, honestly, we got out pretty quick. No, we didn't want to see the bulldozers and stuff. So we left to another farm. But it was this kind of big moment, in an early, early tween era of thinking like, wow, I never thought that could be a possibility. And so looking back, it's this first kind of experience of a shared farm community being privatized, right? I didn't have that language at all at the time. So this is an actually new view of the pond with the fountains from a manicured lawn and such, very different than the ragtag beach that we were on. And I tell this story, and it sounds like, tragic and sad, but it is actually the norm. It was the pattern of 1980s in New Jersey. I'm living in a historic moment of development of, New York City and the affluence there, kind of spilling over, people wanting to move into the countryside. And so there was nothing unusual about it. In my mind, it was like, this big surprise, but there's nothing unusual. It was a historical moment. We moved on to other farms, and they got sold and developed pretty regularly. We ended up finding one farm that was fairly stable, no pun, it was fairly permanent in that it was attached to a college. I never thought of it, and it still is to this day. It's a horse farm that's a part of a college. So anyhow, you can't really read this writing, but it says, Homedale, New Jersey, the town I grew up in, is the real estate journey from farmlands to luxury havens. So it's an acknowledged thing. There's no big secret here. But it was big. It was transformative. It meant, we were on the move for a while until finding a little bit more of a permanent place. So that's scene one. That's Act 1, Scene 1, right? Early childhood, seeing this transformation of farm. And let's see, Act 1, Scene 2 is when I was in high school. So we landed on this farm that had some stability to it, and I'm going through the motions, still riding a lot of horses, and there's that one high school teacher. Y'all know what I mean? There's that one high school teacher. A lot of people have that one high school teacher that somehow shifts your path or shifts your journey. And so this one high school teacher got Becky off the farm, basically, and wanted to bring a group of New Jersey kids out to understand the beauty and the ecology of old-growth forests in Oregon. So I'm a high school student, and she takes this group of us that are in the environmental club out to Opal Creek, this largest stand of intact old-growth, 1,000-year-old Douglas firs, 3,000-year-old cedar trees, just awe-inspiring. I'd spent a lot of time outdoors, but I'd never seen this kind of an ecosystem. I never felt that presence, and I had no idea there were public lands. I grew up in New Jersey. I didn't know there was large tracts of forests that anybody could walk onto and go camping in, and it was just really big in my world. And we went back multiple times, and it was this one teacher that was willing to take the group of us out there and to learn in a new way. And this is in the middle of 1990s in Oregon. The historical moment was massive logging, right? Selling off old-growth forests, Weyerhaeuser, exporting raw logs to Japan. It was the big moment of accumulating wealth by, this isn't on private land, this is on the public forests, right? So, I get this experience seeing these beautiful forests on public lands, and I'm immersed right in the historical moment of the controversy around logging. So that's scene 2, Act 1, scene 2. Forests, right? Seeing these old-growth forests into private timber sales. And I'm like 16, 17. And this time, I've got something to say about it, right? So thanks to moms for clipping out things from the newspaper. There was actually still, it's all blurry, you can't read it, but it's 1995 or something, me, wanting to write about what's happening to these forests. And a group of us went to D.C. to testify at a subcommittee hearing about these treasures of intact old-growth forests. And so I started finding my voice about this pattern that I was seeing. And now the historical moment is clearly recognized. People are making podcasts about it, right? The timber wars of the 1990s in Oregon. And it just happened to be where I found myself. It's also what got me to college, right? I was going to be training horses. I had no interest in going to college. And this moment of seeing these forests and thinking that there's something should be done is why I was like, okay, I'll put in my application to the state school. Just maybe I'll go, So it got me to the college about 1 hour away from where I grew up on the farm. And I was so homesick, 1 hour away. I'm off the farm, and I'm in this urban area. And there's like 40,000 people, and the lecture hall goes, a mile towards the back. And so I'm, first-generation student, out of my element, but I'm doing all right, and I'm enjoying what I'm learning about conservation ecology. Never would have thought my college years would take me to a fishing town in Alaska, right? So how did that part of the story? Scene 3, Act 1, Scene 3. So one professor, hopefully the teacher, the students in the room can think of one professor here that's really guided your path. So I had this one professor towards the end of my 4 years that said, hey, let's take 12 of you in a 12-passenger van and go drive around Alaska for a month and call it Field Ecology of Alaska. And if any of you know me, I love doing field schools now. I really love traveling around with students in 12-passenger vans. And I think this is why, right? So he takes us for a month, never traveled that far. And we end up in this town, small fishing town called Cordova, Alaska, on the Copper River. We're there for 3 days. He goes fishing, leaves us to our own devices. And I'm like, wow, I'm walking down this little main street, and it's not on the road system, and it's, a little scrappy looking, and there's people that are just working like right alongside the ocean and working on their boats. And I'm feeling this like really different feeling about any other community I've been in. And then on the last night, I saw the Northern Lights. And then I decided I need to live here. So, for anybody that thinks academics have a very linear, intentional path of their research, We don't, right? We follow our gut instinct and we let the northern lights guide us and we do unusual things. But I was like, I'm going to just drop out of school. I mean, I've learned new things. I don't need my degree. Don't ever do that, students, right? But luckily, I had this one good advisor that was like, well, if you put this course here and substitute this for that, you can probably graduate and still do this internship that was offered in this town of Cordova. So I was like, I'm going back. There's this awe, this sense of awe that I was like, I need to experience this. So went to Cordova for a 6-month internship after my undergraduate degree and spent 10 years living there and met the most incredible friends when you're off the road system and it rains the majority of the time and it's dark half the year and you're, not even the phones worked great at that time when I was there. You just meet friends that will 25 years later show up at a talk for you. So that's the kind of deep friendship that this place created. And when I think about, what was my time there of being embedded in a different place, it was about subsistence and being in new relationship with oceans and fisheries. And all those pictures of me riding horses, well, they turned into all these pictures of me fishing. There's a lot of pictures of me with salmon, and in particular, learning not just how to catch a fish with a gill net or a fly rod and whatnot, but like really for the first time engaging in the process of learning about salmon, their importance in community, their importance to culture, how to smoke them, and all the ways that they build into the social fabric. So it was very meaningful to have the privilege of being immersed in there and learning from the native village of Eak would have these subsistence salmon feeds for the community, for their elders, and I gained so much from really being connected to tides and weather and the knowledge that people stored in their bodies and souls about how to live in the ocean. And at the same time, the historical moment I found myself in was this deep threat about salmon aquaculture. And if you haven't heard of that word, it means like fish farming, essentially. So it means taking what would be a wild capture fishery where people, whole communities go out and catch fish and come back together to sell them to the processors and whatnot. You pen them up. You create, private corporate control. You own the eggs and the salmon for the whole life cycle, and you pen them up in the ocean, and you own them for the whole time. And it's more of an industrial farming technique, right? It was very different, and it wasn't happening in the town I was in. Actually, it was banned in Alaska, the whole state. But it was entering the global market from Chile and Norway and British Columbia. And there was this deep fear of what's this going to do to the lifeblood of our town, the economy that it rests on? And so people started studying the ecological impact of fish farming to try to show, I won't even go into all of it, but what is the ecological implications of fish farming and what it might do to the ecology of these very pristine Alaskan waters. But I think I started emerging as a sociologist at this point. I wanted to know, what is that going to do to the people, the social fabric, the work that comes from knowing how to maintain your boat and where the sandbars are, and what will be the social impacts of taking this ocean commons and community fishery and privatizing it into a new form, right? A new relation to production. So it was the fisheries that got me inspired to go to graduate school, right? I was like, I've got the farm and I got the forest and now I've got this fishery. I want a systematic way to understand more about the roots of why this is happening, right? So that's why I started going back to graduate school in environmental studies and then found my way to environmental sociology to really understand this intersection. And so now we're into scene 2, right? So now we're starting into my research world. This was my slide of my dissertation, and I wanted to understand the social and community impacts of this change in a way of relating to oceans and fisheries, right? From more of a common community to the privatized. So this is where I got to learn a lot about the methods of qualitative research, right? You can put out surveys and do quantitative work with large data sets, and I did do that for part of my dissertation to look at global marine fisheries. But then there was this part of my dissertation that's called the ethnographic, and I know we have some of our senior research students that are writing their ethnography papers right now. And so it means, you go out and you live it. Go to these communities where fish farming is happening and live there and talk to people and ask them about their lives and ask them what might be changing. And so, like I said, Alaska had banned the salmon farming, but British Columbia, Vancouver Island had welcomed it in with open arms. So I was like, and they said this mix of commercial wild capture fisheries and this influx of salmon farming. So that was the start of my research, was to move there and to talk with people and try to understand how the social relationship to the environment is affected, disrupted, based on this new kind of privatization. So many, many interviews. We're certainly not going to look at all of them, but I just wanted to give this little snippet of what it's like when you're out and talking to people and hearing their stories and hearing what's very unique about their lived experience, and then looking for patterns. So thinking about how access to the marine environment was impacted when people couldn't harvest from the low tide zone. Talking to commercial fishermen that then had to go work in the net pen industry because it was kind of the jobs that were around, and hearing how their perception of the fish changed. They wouldn't eat the salmon from a net pen, but they would, and it actually is, there wasn't a public health scare. It's fairly similar, but the perception of it being something that they would use as a food source shifted. They also talked about the labor process shifting, where a worker, I remember, said, "Oh, well, now I get paid from the neck down," right? Meaning, you're feeding pellets, you're cleaning the pens, but it's not, you don't have agency or control over your relationship to being involved in a fishery. So we'll spend months and months living and interviewing, and then we have to look all academics. We put together tables and think about, okay, who was my sample? What is the relation of protection? And what thematic variants am I interested in? And so this was all part of me learning and in my dissertation work of how to do qualitative research. And it was, the de-skilling, the loss of intergenerational knowledge, the loss of access to a commons all emerged. The impact of First Nations communities emerged as themes that I shared out to add to the ecological impacts. So now we're in my research, but scene 2. So I wanted to challenge the assumption that fish farming is just progress and it's inevitable and it's good, and complicate that. But also, I didn't want to only just be about the specifics of salmon aquaculture. Like, that was important to me as where I was living. But I wanted to take this broader view of what's the social context that creates these patterns of farms and forests and fisheries being transformed from the public good, the public commons, into private property for individual gain. So I also took a theoretical look at what's justifying this. And the assumptions are, well, of course, it's great. You're going to prevent the tragedy of the commons from happening, and I'll explain what that is. And you're going to make profit from a commodity, and that's what we do. That's the rules of the game. That's the economic system we're operating in, and so that's just what you do. And so I wanted to, in my first decade of research, also challenge these underlying assumptions. So here's the one slide that kind of seems like a lecture. So students, brace yourself. What is the tragedy of the commons? Some of you maybe have heard of it. Some of you might be complete blank. But it's this phrase, this concept that got coined by Garrett Hardin in 1968. Wrote an article, and he said, there's two fundamental things that everybody knows. Humans are greedy, resources are scarce, and therefore, in the context of when we have a shared forest that people would gather firewood for, or a shared grazing pasture that everybody would put their sheep on, we humans, all humans in all time, you'll see my critical view, humans will rationally act, because that's what we do all the time, right? We're so rational. We'll rationally act in their own self-interest, because we're born greedy and selfish, and therefore the resource, whatever it is, the trees, the fish, the grazing lands, will be exploited, and the community will suffer. That's just the way it goes when you have a commons. This is one of his famous quotes: "Freedom in commons brings ruin to all." Right? There's a short article, and it led to massive policy implications that said, well then, if that is true, Garrett Hardin, we need to enclose the commons, right? We should privatize it, and that will help benefit the resource. It will help the well-being of the community. It had massive implications for environmental management for decades. 48,000 times being cited, right? Some people say it's the most influential scientific article when they survey biologists and such. So very influential, but there's one problem. It's not true, right? It's this really interesting example of how an idea can take hold in a historic moment and be widely used and widely referenced with having nothing to back it up. He talks about, if any of you environmental studies majors have read it, he talks about the pasture and the sheep, and they'll get overgrazed. There was no pasture. There was no sheep. It's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor that made sense to somebody sitting in a desk, but there was actually no data, no evidence. Certainly, not looking at the history of sociocultural evolution, peoples all over the world that have lived near oceans and near forests and farming that have lived with balance and reciprocity. And so there's a lot of people that have critiqued this, right? Scholars from Native American Indigenous Studies, scholars from anthropology, scholars from history. I put Eleanor Ostrom up there because she's even from the economics field, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first woman to win. No, sorry, I've got Peace Prize on the mind. You know why? The Nobel Prize in economics for disproving the tragedy of the commons, right? So highly recognized person in the field, thinking a lot about settler colonial history and whose commons and commons in Europe, and that got overlaid in other places and the worldviews that came with them. So a lot of critique, and yet it's stuck. And so much so that it still sticks to this day, right? Even with a lot of scholarship. So it's based on an economic ideology of neoliberalism and privatization and commodification as a way to, grow business. It was not at all based on sociocultural history or much of the academic world. So I wanted to get my hat in the ring. I certainly was not the first person to critique the tragedy of the commons, but I was like, I have this case of oceans and fisheries that haven't been talked about, and I want to use my research to help try to reframe this theory. And so I started really interrogating the theory behind commodification. And a commodity is basically when we take something that has all kinds of intrinsic values inherent in itself, into the ecosystem, into the people, and we narrow it down to a dollar sign, right? So that's this thing that is complex and multidimensional, and we only see it as a price in a market. So I wanted to understand, well, that's not just supply and demand. Like there's much research about understanding the economic system of capitalism and how commodification has developed under there. And then understanding the enclosures, like how are the enclosures of the ocean similar to enclosures of land? And then I started working with a fellow grad student. When you students here, when you go to grad school, you meet really cool people, and they become longtime friends. And so my good friend Stefano was looking. He was from Sicily, and he's understanding bluefin tuna and what's happening in Sicily. And then I'm saying what's happening in Alaska with salmon. And so we're like, dang it, we are writing a book about this. We're going to try to have one more little piece of the puzzle of saying it's not the tragedy, is not the commons. Like, yes, there is tragedy. We're not, and by that we mean environmental depletion, environmental exploitation. Forests are suffering, fisheries are suffering, farmland. So we're not denying there's a tragedy. We're denying that the root cause of it is that it's held in commons. And what we were putting forward is that the root cause of it is that in this historical context, the things that are part of the commons are only seen as commodity. And therefore, we're playing by the rules of the game, right? The same person that owned that farm that I grew up on, they were not a bad person. They were a very kind person that was playing by the rules of the game in that moment that said, this is what you do, right, with a commodity. So we tried to do a little fun twist on the term and say it's not a tragedy of the commons, it's the tragedy of the commodity. And so that was probably about 10 years of my life, I just went through in 3 slides, was about trying to, do research to a specific place, and then also reframing a long-held assumption about the tragedy of the commons. So I also want to add how not only the content of my research changed, but the way I thought about research, the way I understood research, the role of researchers completely shifted and changed after a few years of getting the job here at Fort Lewis and, realizing, well, salmon and oceans aren't that relevant to folks in Durango. I mean, we all care about them, but, you want to do work that's meaningful to the area. And so, learning more about the Animas River, and a few years into me being here, we had the pollution event of the Gold King mine spill, which had acid mine drainage in the Animas River. And so I was doing some work locally in Durango to ask about people's impact when they see the river being polluted. And I went to some talks about it, and I felt so grateful and privileged that there was a really large, in-depth research project happening on the Navajo Nation, led by Dene researchers at the University of Arizona and NAU, to say, yeah, that's great. You're looking at the economic impacts of the river pollution event, up about river guides and rafters and hotels, but there's a very different impact, right, to Dene farming communities. And so I was asked to be an assistant under the direction of their leadership to understand the impacts of this shift in a relationship to a river. So I learned about a much different way of approaching research. I learned about, it's not all about the data analysis, it's about how you set up the interviews with cultural consultation, and you are guided by that more than something in the literature, and that there's this inherent decommodified relationship to water that's in our neighboring communities around us, and tribal communities right here and right now. We don't have to be looking at in hundreds of years ago. These are vibrant and alive and present all around us. And so my research took a shift in collaboration with many, many other people, again, to talk about culturally anchored qualitative approaches to doing research, and to talk about how Dene-centered research reframes how we think about the impacts of a water pollution and the social and spiritual and cultural impacts of that relationship changing when a river is now seen as damaged, right? And it was a part of also a larger research effort that Fort Lewis College did, with people in different disciplines all around campus wrote about how their discipline thinks about the river spill. So it was a great collaborative effort. And again, the things I learned in graduate school, like 10 years previous, completely shifted and changed. So I think that's another lesson as you get involved in research. The thing you go to grad school for, you have to be willing to let go of all of it, right? And to see in new ways and learn from mentors and learn outside of the walls of academia. So that really reframed the way I think about research. Okay, still with me? Ready for Act 3? We're good? We don't need intermission? Okay, all right. So Act 3, so that was about 10 years, 12 years of publishing and writing books and working with other scholars and learning how to really think differently about the kind of work. And Act 3 is about public sociology. How do you take this research and think, what does it offer to the communities that I'm around? So for me, it was like, well, I'm talking all about how commons aren't the problem. So then how do we actually try to build and amplify and be involved in the act and the work of commoning, right? Making it a verb. It's not just a thing. How do we participate in being involved in commons? And it doesn't have to just mean land. It can mean in many different things. So I put these books up here. I don't know. I haven't read them. I didn't write them. I wasn't involved in them. But I put them up here to say there's a lot of people writing about this topic. And at this point, maybe because you get 20 years in, you're like, I don't think I need to write for a journal article anymore, right? Don't tell the deans, right? But I'm like, I don't think I want to do that anymore. I think I want to think about how I'm going to engage, what this research has taught me. And other people are doing amazing work on writing about it and publishing it, and I'm so happy they're doing it. But it felt like it was time for me to switch and see the commons that are all around us and see the value that they're bringing to our community. So I want to start by just saying I'm not going to use examples that are in other countries or in other places, although there are many. I want to think about our campus and the parameters of Durango, right? Because sometimes you can think, oh, well, Becky, in order to, decommodify everything and transform our relationship to land and massively have land reform, that's going to take a huge radical change, and it's probably not happening in the near future. Those of you know me, I wouldn't be opposed to massive radical change. And there's a lot happening right now that's, emerging all around us that happens in these spaces that shows that we are not born inherently greedy, that we are not always meant to be competitive. There might be a social context that rewards that behavior, right? But there's plenty of other contexts where we see people organizing differently. And so, the Grubhub, it's great. Who loves the Grubhub, right? Grubhub, yes. And it's radical. It's decommodifying our perception to food, right? It's a way of shifting that you can walk in and leave with food without needing to exchange a rectangular green piece of paper, right? Food as a human right. And so it's meaningful in the day-to-day, and it's shifting. And a lot of folks, when we walk in, we feel nervous, right? We're taking stuff, and we're like, it feels like we're stealing, But what would it be like if food was decommodified? Yeah? Apple Days happened last weekend. Seems like just good old apple pie, fun activity. We are radically thinking differently about community food sources. When we say that apple tree that's on your private property, that's your apples, we're shifting that and saying, no, actually the whole community is going to go out and harvest this bounty that happens in a few weeks and bring it together to a public park and press it into cider, right? It's really changing the way that we think about who owns a tree and who owns an apple, right? The old fort, many of you here have been involved in working out there. Do you know there's an incubator program, how to incubate and hatch new farmers by saying, we know land is so expensive here. So how can we, offer this land at below market value for long-term leases so you can get your foot in the door to being a farmer? So it's shifting property relations, right? In my classes, I teach about water and water justice. Acequias is probably a word that's not familiar to most, but I've learned about them. It's a completely different new way of relating to water rights. We feel like we're so stuck in junior and senior and prior appropriation. And this is a very old system of thinking about water from North Africa that came to Mexico that is now operating in the San Luis Valley just 3 hours from here, 2.5 hours from us. There's communities operating in a completely different model of how to share a commons of irrigation water, right? I have students in the room that are working on a resolution to City Council on acknowledging the rights of rivers, the inherent rights, not the commodified rights, but the inherent rights of our Animas River, and they're out at City Council meetings. And so there's this action that's happening all around us. Solar barn raising, we have our engineering students here participating in helping to think about, solar is fairly expensive to buy individually. How do we all help each other out? I'll go to your house and put your panels on, and you come to my house. And we did that, and people really showed up. And I'm a radical sociologist, and I still had my doubts. Were people really going to show up? I'm not paying them. They don't know me. Why would they just show up on a Saturday to do this? And they did, right? And then I made lunch, and we put our solar panels up, and then I went to their place. And so this is a model that's happening right before our eyes that's showing how we can collectively think about knowledge as a commons, right? The technical knowledge of installing solar panels, I would think maybe that's not for me. And then sure enough, I'm on my roof and doing it. So it's how do we collectively understand that we can all have access to this? It doesn't have to be one private company that does it. I'm going to wrap up with something that I've actually been a little bit more directly engaged in, and that's land access. I have to give a shout out to the Animas mobile home community. You all know about the very first in the state of Colorado that changed the trailer park from being privately owned to being held in commons and managed by a cooperative board of residents. First one in Colorado to do that and to change up this idea of how we think about housing. 120 residents, all in a cooperative that's not privately owned by an investor, right? So CLPS is something nobody knows because we just founded it 2 months ago. It is the Community Land Partnership of the Southwest. So we thought about land in this area. La Plata County is so expensive, and it is one of the main barriers for new and beginning farmers that want to create a more just and regenerative, wholesome food system. So how can we be creative? How can we imagine something different, right? And sometimes it's the hard work of having the money to do it, and sometimes it's the hard work of imagining that something can be different, right? So this was where I think my public sociology, those other examples are just great things happening in Durango, and I'm involved in little parts and pieces of it. But we wanted to do research and say, well, what can we learn that's specific about other movements around the country that are trying to shift up our relations to property? So certainly land back, indigenous-led movements, the agrarian commons, there's groups that are thinking about, instead of all against all, how do we think more cooperatively, all for one? Different models. We looked at models that are already happening, of Fonzie's Farm and other things. We held community listening sessions. Again, this wasn't research to be published somewhere. It was like research to think about how we do something in our community. And we were working within the rules of the game, the constraints of a private property capitalist economy. So we needed to hire lawyers to say, what can we do in this context that's different, that we can imagine something differently. So 2 months ago, I'm on the founding board of the Community Land Partnership of the Southwest. And what that means is it's a legal structure that can hold common land. So there's a lot of farmers that are aging in our area. They have big tracts of land. They don't have a succession plan of like who's going to keep farming on their land, but they want it to stay for food systems or ranches, but they don't know who. So we created this entity. It's under the nonprofit of the Montezuma Land Conservancy. We created an LLC that could, purchase or receive donated large tracts of land, hold them in common, and then put out an application for many farmers or ranchers or fiber producers that want to then have, below market long-term leases to use that land more as a shared space. They don't have to go buy 200 acres themselves, right? But you need a structure to hold that commons, and you need, agreements on what's going to happen on that commons, and you need norms, and you need conflict resolution, and you need a lot of structure, right? Open access commons are, that's a very different scenario. So what is it like to build a community and have a way that land can be legally transferred to be held in common? So it's only 2 months old. We have a few pilot projects in the works, but it feels really good to take those years and years of research of critiquing something, that I was against, and then writing kind of theoretically about what should be, and then really trying to, act on it, do something in our community. So in case any of you were wondering, I still hang out with horses a lot. It wasn't just little Becky that did that. And I hang out with horses with my mom and my daughter. So there's 3 generations of us still involved in horses. So just because you go to academia doesn't mean you have to lose who you are, right? And the way they were able to do this is because there's county land called the La Plata County Fairgrounds. You know where that is, next to the high school and the rec center. And it's public land. It's owned by the county. It's not privately owned. And they allow you to keep your horse there for $35 a month, right? So you don't have to, we wouldn't around here be able to buy a farm or buy a ranch or build a barn, but we can still be immersed in this shared experience with a handful of other families of, having our horses there and having our goats there and going and doing chores. And I love, after leaving a long day in academia, you can go clean some horse stalls. It feels very satisfying. And this is what the property looks like. And there's a handful of other families there, and we look after each other's horses, and we take turns feeding in the morning, and we work collectively on shared property. So again, when you think that, claiming the commons, this sounds so radical, remember, there's examples of it happening all around us, and there's nothing to say that it's in our human nature to not be cooperative and collective and to care for one another. That's the end.